The 1996 film Scream is a horror romp that pays homage to the great classics of the genre while poking fun at some of the more tired tropes. The opening scene of Scream is one of the most iconic in all slasher movies, revitalizing the genre which has become somewhat stale in the previous decades. Casey Becker, portrayed by Drew Barrymore, appears to be the perfect Scream Queen trope protagonist for the movie, a blonde, bubbly, and flirty teen unsuspecting of the danger lurking nearby. She begins her innocent conversation with a stranger on the phone without a hint of suspicion or worry, casually cooking stovetop popcorn and chatting about her love of scary movies, specifically Halloween. The script of the film describes her as no more than 16, a friendly face with innocent eyes. While Scream is firmly cemented in the 90s pop culture with its iconic imagery and the expertly balanced fear and laughter it induces, the real-life inspiration for the film is nothing but a tragic and horrific event. While writing the script for Scream, screenwriter Kevin Williamson was partially inspired by the terrifying acts of the Gainesville Ripper, who took the lives of 5 young students in Florida over the course of a few days in August 1990. Like the killer in Scream, the Gainesville Ripper tended to target young female students and used a knife as his weapon of choice and had an unknown motive. The lives taken by the Gainesville Ripper, unlike in Scream, were very much real. In late August 1990, the college town of Gainesville, Florida, was rocked by the news of 5 murders in the span of just 3 days. On August 26, 1990, the bodies of Christina Powell and Sonia Larson were found at their off-campus apartment. The students, 17 and 18 years old, respectively, were about to begin their freshman year at the University of Florida. When their parents were unable to get a hold of them, shortly after a move-in, a member of a building management and police officer entered the apartment when no one answered and found the bodies of both students. They were both found on beds, with Larson in a peculiar position, with her feet on the ground and her hair fanned out behind her on the bed. They were both stabbed to death, and Powell had been raped and mutilated. The following day, another victim was found. 18-year-old Krista Hoyt was a student at Santa Fe Community College and worked at the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. Officers were sent to her apartment after she failed to show up for a shift. There, they discovered that she too had been stabbed to death, raped, and even decapitated. Like Larson, her body seemed to be posed. She was in a seated position with her feet on the ground and her upper body slumped forward. The next morning, the final 2 victims were found. High school friends Tracy Paulus and Manuel Taboda, both 23-year-old undergrad students, were found in the apartment they shared. Again, both were stabbed to death, and Paulus had been raped and was posed on the living room floor. The news of these 5 deaths rocked the town of Gainesville. The typical excitement of a new school year, as students reunite with friends or begin a new chapter, was replaced with fear as students made their way to and from classes, always looking over their shoulders, locking their doors tight, and hoping they weren't next. This fear, unlike the fictional Scream, was very much real and very warranted. One of the police's first suspects was an 18-year-old man named Ed Humphrey. They had received several tips from the public that he might be involved. He was arrested on August 31st on unrelated charges of assaulting his grandmother, and a $1 million bond was placed on him. However, some, including the ACLU, questioned the police's conduct in detaining Humphrey with such a high bail for an assault charge. His family made it known that Humphrey had been on medication for a mental health disorder, leaving some to suspect that Humphrey was a person of interest to the police solely based on his mental health status, instead of actual evidence. Semen found at some of the scenes was analyzed with primitive DNA technology, which informed investigators that the killer's blood type was B. This left them with a bit of a problem, as Humphrey's blood type was A. During investigations, police became aware of an unsolved case in Shreveport, Louisiana from the previous year that contained some similarities to the murders in Gainesville. On November 4th, 1989, 3 people from the Grissom family were all brutally murdered in William Grissom's home. 55-year-old William himself, his 24-year-old daughter, Julie, and 8-year-old Sean, who was Julie's nephew and William's grandson, were all stabbed to death. Their bodies were found a few days later during a welfare check. In addition to the same type of murder weapon, there were a couple of other similarities between cases. As with some of the women in Gainesville, Julie was also raped, and vinegar had been applied to her body in a similar fashion as soap had been applied to 2 of the Gainesville victims. Investigators were also able to determine the blood type of the Shreveport perpetrator. type B. Shortly after this discovery, a woman from Shreveport called Crime Stoppers in November 1990 after hearing about the Gainesville murders and gave them the name Danny Rolling. She remembered her husband telling her that Rolling, an acquaintance of theirs, was trouble and had a penchant for stabbing people, but she didn't want to believe he was capable of the gruesome murders. However, when she heard the news of the murders in Florida, she had to say something. When investigators looked into Rolling, they found that he had multiple run-ins with the law in the past for armed robberies in several states. Once police discovered Rolling's rap sheet, they soon realized that he might have been responsible for a bank robbery which occurred the same day Krista Hoyt's body was discovered, less than a mile away from her home. On the night of the robbery, a police officer noticed a man around a wooded area and followed him to a campsite, but the man took off before apprehension. At the campsite, the officer found a bag of dyed cash from the robbery, along with a gun, a screwdriver, and a cassette player with a tape in it, which was all taken into evidence. Police initially made no connection to the murders as there was a gun at the site, but all the victims had been stabbed. For some reason, no one listened to the cassette tape upon collection. If they had, they may have found their suspect much sooner, as the recorded man's voice stated his full name, Danny Harold Rolling. When police finally listened to the cassette tape, Rolling had already been arrested for another robbery at a supermarket in Marion County. They were then able to determine Rolling's blood type, which was type B. He was charged on November 15, 1991 with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each of the Gainesville murders. Before standing trial, he was sent to Florida State Prison for federal bank robbery charges. While there, he told another inmate highly detailed information about the murders and eventually confessed to investigators that he committed the Gainesville murders. However, Rolling would not confess to the Shreveport murders during questioning. On November 5, 1994, the trial for the Gainesville murders began, and the jury eventually recommended that Rolling receive 5 death sentences for his crime. On October 25, 2006, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection, but not before writing a note in which he confessed to the Shreveport murders. While it bears little resemblance to the true events, one could argue the opening sequence of Scream and the slaying of Drew Barrymore's Casey Becker character captures some of the horrifying elements of the Gainesville murders. Barrymore was around 21 years old when she was cast as Casey, a character who was written as a 16-year-old. It's a common practice in film to cast older actors as high school students, but the costume designer, hair and makeup artist aged her down with a short blonde bob with bangs, along with a high V-neck, white sweater, which would add to her innocent look and heavily contrast with bloodstains. The phone call setup from Ghostface is a likely nod to the common horror trope of a babysitter left home alone. Tormented by a malicious stranger, this trope is found in several 1970s horror films, such as Halloween and When a Stranger Calls, which have each been remade over the years. Some trace elements of this trope to an unsolved murder case. Janet Christman was slain by an unknown killer while she was babysitting for the Romack family in 1950. This tragedy sparked several urban legends that found their way into some of the most chilling horror flicks of the 1970s and beyond. Within the first minute of the opening scene, cinematographer Mark Irwin begins cultivating a feeling of unease by using a Dutch angle as Ghostface calls Casey a second time. Irwin is no stranger to gore, having worked with David Cronenberg on both The Fly and The Brood and other stomach-churning horror films in the late 1980s, including The Blob. Casey's sense of security is shattered when she realizes that Ghostface is close enough to see her as she talks to him on the phone. Scream really exploits this terrifying notion of safety and rescue being just out of reach, and the familiar comforts of home destroyed by a violent intruder. Drew Barrymore talks specifically about taking comfort away from her audience with her role as Casey Becker. In the horror film genre, my biggest pet peeve was that I always knew the main character was going to be slugging through at the end, but was going to creak by and make it. What I wanted to do is to take the comfort zone away. So I asked if I could be Casey Becker so that we would establish that the rule does not apply in this film. The seemingly main character of the film being brutally killed off within the first 12 minutes of the movie was a creative false start that would not only throw the expectations of the viewers, but set the stage for the character Sidney Prescott to emerge as the heroine. The Gainesville Murders is a heartbreaking and horrendous real event that inspired a truly innovative horror film. The imaginative film skillfully entertains us with its self-awareness of horror cliches, unexpected twists, and a heavy dose of humor. But the film is just that, imaginary. Let us not forget that the victims of the Gainesville Ripper, however, were very real, and their tragic loss of life is still felt to this day.